Sounds Productions presents Mean Streets, a nostalgic look at 2D beat-em-ups. Written by Alan Stairs, read by Adam Nichol. Introduction. This audiobook is created mostly out of a collection of articles written for the Old Oil House by Alan Stairs. We all thought that these were fantastic articles, and it seemed a shame that they were just going to sit there on the site. So, after a little bit of confusing and persuading, we decided to try and make it into an audiobook. Since then, I have now left the Old Oil House, and I'm now concentrating on this, the Riveted Sounds production company. Where else were we going to turn for our first proper big release? But to Alan. These articles are a collection of memories and thoughts of a certain time, a place in the world which is now long gone, that being the arcades and home game consoles of the 80s and 90s. It may seem strange to say that what we have here is just a collection of memories, but that's to not allow the power of memories and the power of nostalgia its due. Both of these things are incredibly important, and as we live now, as 30-somethings, as we get older, we all realise that life is not what we thought it was going to be when we were younger. So, these little things that we look back at, the hits of nostalgia and the power of memory, these are important to us. They are things that we enjoy. They are things that we, now, as adults, don't just look back on and think, oh, life was better when we were children. But where did the time go? How did we get here? So with this in mind, I invite you to take a little wander through a path with us. A peruse through a park, you might call it. And I hope that you enjoy the memories that Alan manages to unlock with his words. Adam Nichol, April 2017. Chapter 1. Births. When it comes to subgenres of games, everyone has, and always has had, their own preference. But in the golden era of gaming, it was pretty obvious what the preferred style of game was, and to paraphrase a famous games magazine of the time, nothing beats the satisfying smack of a fist in the mouth. After the martial arts film craze of the 1970s, people were starting to embrace gaming as the interactive alternative, and all of a sudden, the world was crazy for beat-em-ups. The term beat-em-up has some split opinions on definition, but two distinct subgenres exist. Some refer to side-scrollers as beat-em-ups, whereas others call competition fighters the same name, but in reality, they are all beat-em-ups, as they involve, well, beating people up. An easy way of describing them would be simply to put the words scrolling or one-on-one before the term, but many other names have cropped up over the years. Brawlers, competition fighters, smack-em-ups, and simply fighters. But they all point to the same bruised and blood-soaked genre, and both styles of game have their roots. Beat-em-ups came to be in the mid-1980s, well, 1984 to be exact, with the release of what could be considered the very first beat-em-up. Karate Champ was a one-on-one martial arts simulator developed by Technos Japan and published by Data East, and despite looking and sounding phenomenally 8-bit, the game was rather complex in nature. Arguably the most accurate depiction of the martial art that has been made into game format, although the setting is heavily geared towards the sport of karate, rather than the grimy street self-defense that the beat-em-up genre is known for. In the game, you play a nameless karateka who enters a competition, and you face off against an opponent in red. Sound familiar? And that's it. Karate Champ was unique in that it had 2 joysticks instead of a single joystick and buttons, so pulling and pushing combinations resulted in a selection of standard karate moves, which seemed to be very accurate to the martial art itself. Karate Champ also differed from its later one-on-one offspring in that there were no energy bars of any kind. It was a one-hit, one-point, or ippon deal, and then on to the next round. The system made you choose your attacks cautiously instead of just mashing and hoping for the best, as you didn't have the energy bars to pad the round out, and this added an acute sense of tension to the proceedings, and also a certain amount of strategy that is not uncommon in a real karate match, as someone who has been in a few karate competitions can testify to. Karate Champ also offered up some fun bonus stages in the form of bull dodging, block breaking, and other fun breaks from the concentration. The next phase in the beat-em-up's evolution was also to come in 1984, when IREM released Kung Fu Master in arcades, and hence the very first scrolling beat-em-up was born. Kung Fu Master was a simple affair that was obviously based in part on Bruce Lee's concept for Game of Death, but one that would shape the fighter for years to come. In the game, your girlfriend is captured, a plot device almost murdered by its own overuse in the genre, and you have to go and rescue her by entering a temple with 5 floors, each guarded by a boss. The game plays by the player walking from left to right, or vice versa, on a one-hit plane, pseudo-platform environment, and hitting baddies who would fall off screen with one hit. With an arsenal of one-punch, one-kick, and matching crouch and jump variations, it was fiendishly simple, but deliciously addictive. Baddies rushing on screen from in front and behind you, as you gleefully smack them off the platform with your finely tuned skills. With 5 levels, each with its own boss and a variation of enemies, it was a great coin guzzler of the day, and a feature of a many smoky arcade and greasy chip shop. In 1986, a significant leap forward was made in gameplay with the release of Renegade, as it was known in the West. Although not looking particularly pretty, the game took the street brawling concept to another level by adding a pseudo 3D environment where you could actually move back into the screen for greater depth of field, and added other items like weapons and greater enemy variety. The game itself, although it did scroll somewhat, couldn't really be called a scrolling beat-em-up, as the action took place in what could only be described as rooms, or arenas, where the goal wasn't to move from left to right, but to clear the room of enemies before cutting to a new location. Technos would later take the template of Renegade and mould it into its later game, which changed the face of scrolling beat-em-ups forever. In 1998, IREM were back in the game, with an updated version of their groundbreaking scrolling beat-em-up formula with the release of Vigilante, which was almost an identical copy of Kung Fu Master in terms of playability, but featured vastly superior cosmetic updates. In Vigilante, Madonna is kidnapped by the Skinheads, a vile street gang who ironically sport some rather fetching hairstyles, despite their suggestively baldy name, and as the tough guy in town, you have to go and rescue her. The moves and controls in Vigilante are identical to Kung Fu Master, which retains the one-plane movement, but the setting has been transported from a temple to the grubby streets of a down-and-out city. The graphics have been heavily updated, with some lush detail given to the backgrounds, and the sound has been given a complete makeover, with some funky 80s music and gloriously OTT sound effects. Vigilante was again a success in the arcades, and started the trend of mean streets beat-em-ups, where smelly, tramp-infested, low-life urban settings would be the staple brawler environment, and despite its obvious emperor in new clothes status, it was a huge step forward in terms of tone and feeling for the genre. Vigilante may have come after Double Dragon, but it spread the word of the side-scroller far and wide. The home market would not be immune to the beat-em-up trend either, giving smelly children the chance to kick the hell out of each other in a blocky virtual world, sometimes leading to kicking the hell out of each other in the real world. The first, most famous, and arguably best of these were Konami's AR Kung Fu and Way of the Exploding Fist by Melbourne House. Both released in 1985 for the 8-bit computer home market. Although Kung Fu was originally an arcade title, it was arguably more famous for its home computer incarnation. Both games are one-on-one fighters, with Way of the Exploding Fist being little more than an excellent version of Karate Champ, but was probably also the best, and maybe only, martial arts game on the ZX Spectrum at the time. Kung Fu took a further step towards actual combat with its life meters and variety of moves, as well as its colourful graphics and character variety, which, until this point, hadn't really been seen in a one-on-one game. Both games were released across the systems, with Way of the Exploding Fist being hit on the ZX Spectrum and Kung Fu becoming popular on the Commodore 64. After the release of Karate Champ and Kung Fu Master, many clones of the games were made, but these two were undoubtedly the start of the genre for one-on-one scrollers. In the martial arts sense, at least, if one does not count Sega's 1976 Heavyweight Champ, which, indeed, we do not. The following few years would see leaps and bounds made within the beat-em-up territory as the genre entered the golden age of its lifespan, and as scrollers hit their undeniable peak, although far from their end, and a new monster was coming to take the world by storm. Chapter 2. The Holy Trilogy. By 1986, beat-em-ups were becoming increasingly popular. Irem had all but defined the initial concept for the scrolling beat-em-up with Kung Fu Master 2 years earlier, and arcade-goers were getting a real taste of some decent martial arts action. But the latter half of the 80s saw what could be described as the Holy Trilogy of scrollers, with the clear evolution that came with each game, although some notable mentions were made about the same time that gave gamers some proper MASH fun. With Renegade in 1986 putting a whole new twist on the genre with its depth of field play and all-out style of violence, new things were cooking in the brawler pot. And even though the game wasn't exactly a smash hit in 1987, Technos took the bare bones of their creation, splashed some superior graphics and sound on it with a dirty street punk vibe, and so was born the most important step forward of the genre. And the first in the Holy Trilogy, Double Dragon. Double Dragon was the landmark that everyone had been waiting for. The graphics were bright, colourful, well animated and smooth, and the sound contained some of the most legendary game music ever to be composed, as well as some amazingly meaty sampled punch and kick sound effects, which really added a lot to the impact of the game. Double Dragon's main feature, though, was the addition of the simultaneous 2-player mode, where you and a friend could play on screen at the same time, fighting the baddies, or each other, together. The idea was revolutionary at the time, and added an element to the gameplay that just wasn't present beforehand. For its time, and even now to be honest, Double Dragon is actually quite brutal. There are a few flowery martial arts moves, but this game is a brawler in the truest sense of the word, with some proper dirty fighting techniques, like grabbing a baddie's hair and kneeing him in the face, or a blunt headbutt or elbow to the teeth. Even the opening scene of your girlfriend, Marion, being punched in the stomach and dragged away was a bold move when you really step back and look at it. It really is quite strong stuff. What was rather refreshing is that the fighting in the game wasn't entirely unlike real life. If you hit an enemy, there's a good chance that you will get hit back at the same time. And as we all know now, it's rare to come out of a real-life fight and not look like you've lost even though you've won. The balance of good guy to baddie was pretty even, and make no mistake, these enemies were pretty smart, so being the badass hero wasn't enough in Double Dragon. You had to position yourself correctly, as in real life, and judge things like striking distance, enemy movement, the odds that the baddie would move back as you hit, and all the while 1 or 2 other grunts were pummeling into you. Who were? Technos went on to make 2 sequels, the innovative but not so very different Double Dragon 2, The Revenge, or Double Dragon 1.5 as I like to call it, and the truly awful Double Dragon 3, The Rosetta Stones. The sequels never topped the first game's action gameplay, but they did both have amazing music. It's easy to see why Double Dragon was so popular at the time and has lasted so well. Its guy appeal is almost overwhelming, and it's a tough game to crack too. Later beat-em-ups appeared, which offered bigger graphics and more impressive moves, but for a down-and-dirty street fight with scars, grubby fingernails and teeth that really bite, you couldn't, and still can't, go wrong with Double Dragon. In 1988, Tecmo entered the field with their offering in the second in the Holy Trilogy. Not only did they take the scrolling beat-em-up formula one step further, but they unknowingly started a Nintendo Entertainment System revolution as well. Ninja Ryukenden was released in October 1988 in Japan, and under the name Shadow Warriors in Europe, and Ninja Gaiden in the US. The game did reasonably well, and took the concept of Double Dragon, where players 1 and 2 control a blue and red ninja respectively, to go around a more grubby urban setting, to kick ass and foil a prophecy by Nostradamus. Shadow Warriors gives the player control of some rather flashy moves. The ninja, or ninjas, could perform some stunning acrobatics, such as flips and wall somersaults, and a few of these could be used to trigger attacks, like the neck throw, which looked pretty badass at the time. As many will probably recognise now by the name, Shadow Warriors Ninja Gaiden was ported to the Nintendo NES in 1989. It wasn't a straight port, but converted into an action platformer with a whole new story which spawned 2 sequels. Ninja Gaiden on the NES became a worldwide phenomenon due to its ultra-taxing gameplay and never-seen-before Tecmo Theater cutscenes, which not only made it stand out from other games, but sadly also eclipsed the arcade original, which made some tremendous leaps forward for the scrolling genre. Shadow Warriors, the arcade game, was the very first to offer an attack combo instead of just punch and kick buttons. It was also the first scroller to feature breakable objects and scenery, which had absolutely never been done before. Weapons and such were usually lying around, or brought on by the goons. This became a staple of the genre that, disappointingly, people forget that this game started. Konami hit the fun button in 1989 with Teenage Mutant Ninja, Bob Hero, whichever it is, Turtles, the arcade game. Strikingly good visuals and sound for the time, the game offered a then unheard of simultaneous 4-player mode in which you could control all the turtles on screen at the same time. Although an obvious cash grab for the Turtles' craze, and a very shallow coin guzzler that didn't have much skill other than frantic button mashing, which produced what appeared like random moves, it was good fun nonetheless. Konami later updated the engine and cabinet for the Simpsons arcade game, which in all respects was really just the same game in different garbs. Also, in 1989, a new game was released which set the world ablaze, and is the third and final installment in the Holy Trilogy of Scrollers. Capcom, already an established company after having created the hugely popular Mega Man series on the NES in the 80s, and their arcade division having released a string of titles on their then super mega powerful CPS-1 arcade system, released something that would change everything forever. Final Fight. Final Fight was released in 1989, and put simply, there was nothing like it. Nothing. The graphics were monstrous, with huge sprites all cluttered around the screen, and some amazing animation, as well as thumping music and sound effects. Final Fight took the concept of the scrolling beat-em-up to its absolute peak. The game took the 2-button concept from Shadow Warriors and perfected the attack system with some blistering combos that could be achieved from a simple 1-button mash, and then implemented the now legendary special, or panic, move. For those moments where the enemies were just too much for you, you could push both buttons at once to give a spectacular spinning attack which floored enemies on all sides, although at the cost of some of your energy bar. The biggest distinguishing feature of Final Fight, though, was one that would make Capcom's other game so popular, is that it offered up a selection of different characters to choose to play as, each with his own look and skills. This gave the gameplay tremendous depth, as playing with one character was completely different to playing with the rest. And the beautiful thing was, 2 players could play at the same time, with 2 different characters fighting the bad guys. And put simply, words cannot describe the absolute chaos on screen. The action was frantic, full of adrenaline, and you just didn't want to stop. An expensive train of thought, even for 20p a go back in the day. It's hard to describe just how revolutionary Final Fight was at the time, but a good example is a comparison with Gang Wars, another scrolling beat-em-up also released in 1989 by SNK. Put side by side, you can see the huge leap forward that Capcom made, and just how far ahead of the game they were. Gang Wars is essentially a Double Dragon clone, with similar sized sprites and moves. Although it's a fun enough game, it looks incredibly dated when next to Capcom's Monster, despite being released the same year. This was the state of arcades for the next 2 years, and Final Fight reigned supreme amongst brawlers. The Holy Trilogy was complete, although many clones were made up until the end of the century, even by Capcom themselves, with such games as Cadillacs and Dinosaurs in 1993 and Aliens vs Predator in 1994, both of which tried to replicate the success of Final Fight, but never quite topped it. Sega's arcade division made a bold attempt in 1991 with the 3-player DD Crew, which featured some awesomely funky music and looked like a 70s cop show, but was let down by some pretty horrible hit detection, leading to tons of cheap deaths. It would be Capcom again who would be the ones that realised the scrolling beat-em-up had reached its pinnacle, and they realised there was only one path: to take a mob of players who were still hungry for arcade martial arts action. In 1991, they changed the face of the beat-em-up genre once again, and probably for all time. Chapter 4. Domestic Violence on the Home Consoles. In the 1980s, you could not open a gaming magazine without hearing about Street Fighter II, Mortal Kombat, or some other such game that had cropped up in the arcade. Before then, the home console market had always been a decidedly separate affair from the arcade giants in terms of technology. If one can think of an arcade game as a cinema release, then the consoles and computers were definitely the videos. Videos. Sega had dominated the arcade port world with its Mega Drive, or Genesis, if you're American, as it was really the only home machine powerful enough, at the time, to attempt to copy an arcade game. But Nintendo had an ace up their sleeve that would tip the scales of the home market almost completely. The Super Famicom was released in Japan and boasted a vastly superior set of hardware to the Mega Drive. Add to the fact that Nintendo were already looking very cozy with Capcom due to the Mega Man connection, and things were looking good for Nintendo's new machine. Nintendo went straight for the jugular with the Super Famicom and commissioned a port of the superb Final Fight as one of its earliest games for their new machine. The conversion featured the same huge graphics and violent gameplay that the arcade was famous for the most part. The trouble was that being a brand new machine, and being one of the first games to appear on it, there wasn't a huge amount of time for Capcom to get familiar with the hardware, and hence didn't know all the tricks just yet. And the bad news is that Final Fight SNES suffered some rather harsh losses, such as a playable character, one whole level, and the real dragon punch in the face. The simultaneous 2-player mode was gone. Capcom missed a golden opportunity in 1992 when they released Final Fight Guy, a version of the game which replaced Cody with the missing Guy character from the first game. Many were disappointed that more was not added to Final Fight Guy, such as the industrial level being reinserted, or the 2-player mode being available, which after 2 years since the original Final Fight SNES, would have been relatively easy to implement, and as such was seen more as a cash grab. Mean Machines ran a small section on the game stating that these elements were indeed reinserted, but this turned out to be nothing more than hopeful speculation. Or lies. Developer vultures started to form after a few years after the release of the SNES Final Fight and began to discover the market for alternatives, where one didn't have to be original, just offer up something a bit more. And then the floodgates were well and truly opened. The following year saw the SNES swamped with scrolling beat-em-ups aplenty from a million different companies. The first of these clones was Rival Turf by Jellico, a game notorious for being the first blatant Final Fight rip-off, which offered the slight upgrade of a simultaneous 2-player mode, and some absolutely terrible box art in America. Rival Turf was universally panned by magazines at the time, but in reality is and was a fine and solid game that only had a few minor issues with hit detection. But it sported good graphics, decent sound, and the gameplay was good enough, although such an obvious cash grab was bound to ruffle up a few feathers. Jaleco followed up Rival Turf with the Rushing Beat series of side-scrollers, which, while decent enough games, offered little new to the player, except more of the same. Sega, ever watchful of the market, had not been slouching, and had seen the glorious success of Final Fight in the SNES, and in 1991 they struck back. Up until then, the only real beat-em-ups on the Mega Drive were Budokan, which was relatively more of a sports sim, and Golden Axe, which was close, but really fell under the genre of slash-em-up. So there were no proper fisty brawlers for Sega's flagship machine. But then, they unleashed their answer to Final Fight. Streets of Rage was released to almost universal acclaim and scored top marks right across the board, despite the game really being little more than a Final Fight clone itself. Sega, though, had put their thinking caps on and offered up a game that was simply amazing fun, with the hidden ace of some stunning music by chiptune whiz Yuzo Koshiro, all wrapped up in the tasty two-player ready treat. Time passed, and Sega owners were incredibly happy with their iconic release, but the fact remained that amazing though Streets of Rage was, it still wasn't quite as good as Final Fight, no matter how you looked at it. The sprites were smaller and less well animated, the moves and characters weren't as varied, and some of the sound effects were lackluster. This was partly due to the fact that Streets of Rage was created using the Revenge of Shinobi engine, possibly for development speed, and you can tell this from their similar HUD and some sound effects that both games share. With that in mind, Sega decided to up their game and announced Streets of Rage 2. During development, they released some footage of the near-completed game on a VHS video given away free with one of their UK magazines at the time. The somewhat fuzzy footage showed what looked to be an updated version of the first game, with similar-looking levels, but with undeniably larger sprites and updated sounds. This had whet the appetite for fighting fans, just enough to keep them interested, until the game was unleashed. Streets of Rage 2 was released in December 1992, and almost tipped the scales back to Sega in the console wars. They had taken the concept of Streets of Rage 1 and put everything on steroids, and what popped out was an absolute beast. Everything, and I mean everything, was improved upon. Graphics, sound, gameplay, presentation, the works. The new engine had been written from scratch, and it showed. The sprites were massive and had much more variety. The sound effects were much more crunchy and way more satisfying compared to the cardboardy thwacks of the first game, and new elements had been added to the gameplay, such as the multiple special attacks and vertical scrolling, a first for any scrolling beat-em-up. Much of the praise came from Yuzo's magnificent score, which surpassed the original game by miles, with its iconic mix of house, jazz and dance, with some amazingly catchy melodies. Streets of Rage 2, without question, had surpassed the SNES and Final Fight, and stood head and shoulder above it, and could even go head-to-head with the Final Fight arcade game, and had come out okay, which for a home console which wasn't even new tech anymore, was a tremendous feat. Sega completed the trilogy with the less-than-great Streets of Rage 3 in 1994. The game was little more than Streets of Rage 2, with a few new moves and featured grubby graphics, recycled bad guys from the second game, sound effects that worked, sometimes, and an innovative but annoying soundtrack. The game was playable enough, but didn't really offer anything that new. In 1992, Capcom announced the release of Final Fight 2, a SNES exclusive sequel, and a screenshot appeared in Super Play with some beautiful new locations and an updated Mike Hagar look. The mob went wild, anticipating the start of a to-and-fro series of amazing games between Sega and Capcom, a la Mario and Sonic, because after Streets of Rage 2, Nintendo owners were looking for some payback, and who better to top the genre than those who pretty much perfected it, with a sequel to the game that actually did just that, and on a technologically superior machine no less. Final Fight 2 was released in 1993, not to a roar of success, but rather a Final Fight 2 turned out to be really not much better than any other scroller on the system at the time. The controls and moves were exactly the same, no new attacks or techniques had been added, and it seemed to be a complete waste of time to use the 6 buttons on the controller. The game even had the cheek to steal the vertical scrolling idea from Streets of Rage 2, but didn't really do much with it. Graphically, it was still Capcom quality all round, with huge, colourful sprites and lush backgrounds that really looked like a proper arcade game, and the play was smooth, responsive and fun for the most part, but only one of the new characters, Maki, was even remotely interesting, and the international setting which took the action out of the grimy streets of Metro City just didn't feel right. The sound was also a contrived mix of overly happy music and splatty effects, all saturated in that typical SNES echo that did the job, but never really much more. For a game to carry such an important legacy as this one, and to have the hindsight of not only its own legendary heritage, but also time to have a good look at the competition, even being a solid game fell far below expectations. A third game was also released as a SNES exclusive in 1995, which featured more updated graphics and new characters and moves, but it was a case of too little, too late, as the game wasn't quite different enough. The new characters were boring, and at that time, all eyes appeared to be on the competition fighters. A year earlier, in 1992, the press had literally been cacking themselves as Capcom released what was to be the most successful game of all time for the SNES. The home port of Street Fighter II was met with universal praise from just about everyone, and quite rightly so. Some small graphical sacrifices were made, and the music had been SNESed, but the gameplay was most certainly there in all its glory. Scoring a 98% in Mean Machines, one of the only 2 scores to ever hit that number, the other being Super Mario World, the game was the single biggest reason for the SNES's enormous sales boost, and even more so when Nintendo struck a deal to have it in as the package game that came with the machine later down the line. Once again, the vultures started swarming, and Jaleco, always at the lead, started churning out one-on-one fighters like there was no tomorrow, with Tough Enough being the crown jewel in their otherwise run-of-the-mill catalogue. Home ports of Mortal Kombat and Pit Fighter appeared on both the Sega and Nintendo machines, with some stark differences in both. The Mega Drive Pit Fighter was a graphically cut-down version of the arcade game that lost the sprite scaling, but actually improved on the arcade with smoother action, a wider view field, and was a extremely playable beat-em-up that provided many hours of top-notch fun. The SNES port in comparison was dire, also missing the graphical effects which it so could have easily handled, but with zero attention given to the gameplay. The Mortal Kombat ports caused a bit of a stir though. Nintendo were at that time playing the moral goody two-shoes, and while they were happy to have the game on their system, they banned all use of blood and gore, whereas Sega were more than happy to have all the horrible details in their version. Due to this fact, the Mega Drive port was the most successful, despite the fact it was vastly inferior, with grubby graphics and some chippy sound effects. Compared to the pretty much arcade-perfect SNES port, which replaced the blood with spit and sweat, Sega made the right choice into tapping into Chapter 5. Domestic Violence in the Home Computer Market. Back in the day, consoles seemed to garner much of the attention, and rightly so. They had the best selection of quality games, but that was hardly surprising, given that they had been made for the sole purpose of gaming. But there were other home systems available at the time, and these were the home computers. Long before the rise of powerful Windows-driven machines, the PCs of the time were rather slow business machines, heavily reliant on DOS, and not much good for anything bar maybe a good Lucasfilm adventure now and then. The real daddies on the market were the Commodore Amiga and the Atari ST. Not being exclusively gaming machines, both the Amiga and ST were horribly open to money-grubbing third-party developers who would snap up film and arcade licenses and produce subpar ports to the machines that relied on the name alone to sell the product. Almost every arcade conversion to these machines was a disaster, and unfortunately, the beat-em-ups got it the worst. Rubbish conversions of the original Street Fighter arcade game, Double Dragon, and many more littered the machine, with publishers US Gold being the prime culprit in these dodgy dealings, with Ocean Software handing the crapola film licenses. The most controversial of these ports by far was the Amiga conversion of Final Fight, and one that is still talked about with universal hate to this very day. Amiga Final Fight had massive sprites ripped straight from the arcade machine, as well as some sound effects, too, but the crock came when the players discovered that about 80% of the moves were missing, which turned it into a slow, plodding chore that came nowhere near the frantic arcade original. Enemy placement was random, the special moves were different, and it felt just like the programmers didn't even play the game at all. They did, but that's another story. Amiga Final Fight had no music either, simply because US Gold was too cheap to commission a composer, and the whole thing feels exactly like what it is. An incomplete beta version which was rushed through production and comes nowhere near the potential it could have had, if given the proper time and care. Even the programmer himself, Richard Aplin, says he wasn't a fan of the genre at all, and found the arcade game boring, so it really was doomed from the start with that lack of faith and drive. In saying that, in its own right, the game was a solidly programmed, scrolling beat-em-up, with some clever coding tricks to handle the massive sprites, and it had an awesome title theme song that the programmer pinched from the Amiga demo scene, the composer of which never got paid. As a conversion of probably what is considered the yardstick of all scrolling beat-em-ups, it was atrocious. The other systems fared even worse, with the ST having some horrible jerky scrolling, and the 8-bit machines not even making an effort. Other ports fared a bit better, with the earlier Double Dragon 2 being one of the best. Ironically, programmed by the same guy who did Final Fight, and conversions of the Ninja Warriors, Mortal Kombat, Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja, and then later Street Fighter 2 all fared reasonably well in the translation from arcade machine to computer. Being what they are, the computer world was home to some splendidly talented homegrown development teams, who didn't specialize in ports, but original games designed specifically for the machine. In 1988, lone developer Archer McLean ported his own game to the Amiga and ST from the 8-bit machines. International Karate Plus, or IK Plus as it was known, was a smash hit and routinely called the best beat-em-up on the system. The game is a karate simulator, much like Way of the Exploding Fist, where you control a storyless fighter, but the difference was that you fight not one, but two opponents at the same time. Even in the two-player mode, the CPU would control a third fighter to add some chaos to the proceedings. The game had basic graphics, only one background, but was meticulously programmed with some great moves, a funky tune, and excellent sound effects, sampled from Enter the Dragon. This was all wrapped up in a good sense of humour. German's Thalion did a beautiful and creative job in 1989 with Chambers of Shaolin, which wasn't so much a beat-em-up as a Shaolin sim? The premise being that you guide your Baldy disciple through his training within the chambers, who will then move on to fight real opponents and then the final boss. The game was fairly unique with its puzzly trial stages in the chambers and the combat sections, which were quite nifty, despite the fact you were just fighting a slightly palette-swapped version of yourself. But still, it's a highly commendable game that should be given credit for thinking outside the box. The 90s saw the potential of the Amiga being taken to its limits. Enter Team 17 in 1991, a fresh young Amiga group who were hungry to show what they could do with the machine. And they did just that, with Full Contact, their first official release. Full Contact was a one-on-one beat-em-up dressed in the most sumptuous cosmetics the Amiga had seen yet. From the stunning opening sequence, with animation traced straight from the film Kickboxer, the graphical effects alone told you that these guys knew the machine inside and out, and the music in SFX by legendary game composer Alistair Brimble was, and still is, something to behold, with some wondrously atmospheric sampled oriental sounds. The game itself was fast, smooth and responsive, though while not the deepest and most varied game in the world, it was great fun to play, even just to soak up the atmosphere. Team 17 returned in 1993 with their next beat-em-up, offering Body Blows, another one-on-one fighter, but this time on a hefty diet of better graphics, character variety and competition of the somewhat dire US Gold Street Fighter 2 conversion. Body Blows featured some pretty big sprites, beautifully drawn and animated against some lovely backgrounds, and some clear sampled punch and kick sound effects. The game itself was actually rather clunky and unbalanced, but served as an excellent tech demo for the machine to silence those who shouted, "The Amiga can't handle that kind of game." Some improvements were made for the updated semi-sequel Body Blows Galactic, which featured some even more stunning graphics, sound, and better gameplay. In 1994, Finnish company Terramark released Elfmania for the Amiga, another one-on-one fighting game, but it had the gimmick of cutesy elf-like characters. The game won much acclaim for its absolutely stunning graphics, and possibly some of the best ever seen on the Amiga, and in some cases far surpassed the arcade games of the time, but fell short on gameplay, as there were only a few moves available and no hit sound effects to speak of, which gave the play zero impact and no satisfaction. Cross this with overly floaty jumps, and it was clear that Elfmania wasn't much good past the wow factor of the graphics, and it's a shame that a sequel was never made to sort these problems. With Team 17 and Terramark putting the dodgy arcade game porters to shame, the game was upped, and later ports of Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat were actually fairly decent, especially for the A1200, and newer games like Shadow Fighter and Fightin' Spirit did in fact come quite close to the arcade feel. Just a little too late. Chapter 6. The Clone Wars. If there's one thing that is just as certain as death and taxes, it's that if someone's had a good idea, and it's made money, you can be sure as hell that it will be copied, and copied hard. Games are no different, and the 90s saw what can only be described as swarms of beat-em-ups made by shameless developers trying to claw even a morsel of flesh off the carcass with their usually subpar offerings. Probably the biggest culprit in these proceedings was SNK. SNK were the makers of arcade games, but were also the people behind the much-talked-about Neo Geo home console. The Neo Geo was essentially an arcade machine in a box, as it shared almost identical hardware to its arcade counterparts. The downside to this was that the system and games were horribly expensive, with cartridges costing upwards of 150 English pounds, which, even now, one would think twice about just for one game. The Neo Geo was almost the exclusive domain of rich kids and snidey school goblins with no real worth or friends of their own, but her overprotective mother or a murdered pet that lives buried in the back garden. In the 80s, SNK were a fairly respectable company, not doing anything too different from anyone else. Solid titles like Akiri Warriors and Street Smart were respectable coin guzzlers, but this was back when arcade machines were still rather 8-bit, and the real moneymakers hadn't appeared just yet. But all that changed in the 1990s. A trend that started not long after Final Fight was one of SNK watching what Capcom did, and then start mass-producing clone after clone for the arcade and Neo Geo. The first of these clones was Burning Fight in 1991, a more obvious Final Fight ripoff you could not imagine. Similar characters, a orange-clad martial artist and a blonde guy, similar gameplay, and just a blatant attempt to cash in on a household name. Burning Fight wasn't actually a bad game, much like most SNK, but it's hard to be taken seriously when the arcade manager puts you next to a real Final Fight, and instead of pumping 20p's, people are standing there squinting at you. SNK made the same mishap in 1989 by releasing Gang Wars in the arcade, which was a solid game on par with Double Dragon, but came nowhere near the rage of Final Fight, which was released in the same year, and Burning Fight also suffered from this too late syndrome. SNK continued this trend by swamping the Neo Geo with about 1 million, not joking, scrolling beat-em-ups. Titles like Mutation Nation and the Sengoku series all appear to chant pretty much the same speech, but all seem to lack any real impact or thought to the gameplay. Even the PC Engine got in on the game with Crest of Wolf in 1992, which was, as well, a pretty below-average scroller. When Street Fighter II was released and started smashing records, the SNK Bloodhound was hot on the trail, and the little machine once again began to pump out clones. Art of Fighting became its own series, despite the first game getting average reviews. The clever sprite scaling effect and detailed graphics caved slightly, with the choppy animation and rather cardboardy characters, but they were certainly a good way to kill a few hours, even just to laugh at the abysmal story script. Fatal Fury made a bigger impact and was actually quite popular, despite being much less technical than the Capcom game. The game was quite good to play, and quite a chuckle to spot the rip-off characters. within the game. The graphics and sound were solid, and the game was very playable, with the only downside being the choice of 3 characters amongst a sea of bosses. SNK upped their game in 1992 with the very playable World Heroes, again another one-on-one fighting game. Although very much still a rip-off of the game that had much more character, it was still great fun to play. It didn't top anything graphics or sound-wise, and it suffered from the SNK shadow flicker, but a thoroughly enjoyable smackathon. Not the Glasgow kind, you understand. The game spawned many sequels which were equally as good, although not too different, but the series was a definite step in the right direction. 1993 saw what was probably the jewel in the SNK crown. Samurai Showdown, or Samurai Spirits in Japan, was released to much acclaim. A one-on-one fighting game it may be, but it was different enough from Street Fighter II and its ilk to very much deserve its own praise. The introduction of weapons, some slight gore, and a period setting, this game had a beautiful edge, and combine that with the sprite scaling of Art of Fighting, some amazing graphics and sound, and some incredibly memorable characters, and it could not be anything else but a winner. Samurai Showdown, again, made way for many sequels featuring various improvements in play and design, but the original will always be fondly remembered for breaking the mold. SNK released a zillion other titles in that era, a lot of which this author has not played, or not enough to form a solid opinion on. But back then, you could tell at a glance what an SNK game was, as the feeling of déjà vu would be almost overpowering. But still, a hell of a lot of fun. Chapter 7. The Legacy. So, in the 30-odd years that the beat-em-up has been around, what is the legacy it leaves behind in today's modern gaming world? The first and most obvious answer would be the emergence of the 3D fighter, and it was Sega who started the ball rolling in 1993 with Virtua Fighter, a game consisting almost entirely of 3D polygons. When the game was released, the screenshots in magazines were mildly impressive, and it generated a fair amount of curiosity. But it had to be seen to be believed. With traditional 2D animation out the window, there was literally no limit to how many frames you could have, and so the movement of the players was incredible and eerily lifelike, which added to a real sense of excitement, almost like controlling a film. The game had its other plus points in which there were no OTT special moves like fireballs, nuclear moon farts, or any other such nonsense. It was pure martial arts action, and consequently made for an extremely refreshing and realistic playstyle. It did have its issues though. The moves were a little limited, the jumps were overly floaty, a problem present even in today's games. But as a step forward, it was monumentally massive, especially for the era. Time moved on, and texture mapping started to become a thing. So not only did we get superb animation, it didn't look like a blocky bunch of specky graphics anymore. The next phase in this line was the wonderful Tekken in 1994. More advanced moves, a story, an actual story, and some great music really solidified the game as an out-and-out classic. The arcade-perfect port to the PlayStation the following year made it monstrously well known both inside and outside the arcade, and set in stone the new generation of mega-powerful gaming consoles. And just a mere 3 years after the release of the Super Nintendo. In the UK, at least. It also sadly signalled the demise of the much-loved arcades, as home gaming machines had now reached, and in some cases, surpassed the traditional coin-op. The 3D fighting format hasn't changed much since then, bar some borderline nonsense concepts. But Virtua Fighter and Tekken still hold the crown for the ones who brought the genre into the public eye. More modern 3D titles like Soul Calibur and the sea of something versus something games in which franchises square off against each other have become increasingly popular and increasingly ridiculous. So, what of the 2D fighter? Evolution suggests that the older stage will die out when the newer one comes along, but this was not to be. 2D fighters and scrolling beat-em-ups are still incredibly popular because the change to 3D didn't simply update the genre. It created a whole new one, separate from its 2D brothers, and as such has a different feel of play, which can still appeal to a wide variety of people. Scrolling beat-em-ups like Final Fight and Double Dragon aren't just the dominion of aging nostalgia buffs, like yours truly, but millennial teens and 20-somethings regularly count these games as favourites, even though they may not have been around when they were storming the gaming scene the first or second time around. Of course, the difference in genre hasn't gone unnoticed, and some updates were attempted to try and blend the two. The ill-fated projects of Streets of Rage 3D and Final Fight Streetwise tried to blend a 3D environment with a traditional scrolling fighter, but promptly fell flat. Perhaps not for its attempt at the style marriage, but for missing the point and the feel of the original games almost entirely. Here, in the modern age, the beat-em-up is still immensely popular in both 3D and 2D forms. Not only has the popularity stayed, but the competition has increased dramatically. Modern fighting game competitions are big and highly organised affairs that span the entire globe, and feature players from almost every country in the world, in a way that the 80s and 90s could have only dreamed of back in the day. And these ultra-serious tournaments have led to the creation of competition joysticks. These units, which are now all the rage within the fighting game community, charmingly emulate the old Street Fighter II cabinet controls with an arcade-style joystick and 6 buttons, which solidifies the fact that arcades were magical places, and that magic was enough to influence even those who didn't have a chance to experience the smoky, bleepy game caverns, which were so beloved in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, challengers and cheaters, it's been an honour, a privilege, and a lot of fun trawling through the years of beat-em-ups in this series, and while I fully admit I probably haven't covered a fraction of what's out there, as well as having a slightly retro bias, I hope that this has been informative, nostalgic, and makes you head straight for a good old game of Street Fighter II or Mortal Kombat. Fight! Alan Stairs is Scottish, a music maker, a writer, and all-round nostalgia miner. Deep in his pits, he has found and played more games than you've probably ever heard of.